Tonight, we're covering the history and legacy of one of the most complex and impactful conflicts of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. This was a war shaped by Cold War tensions, fierce resistance, political unrest, and human resilience. It was a conflict that spanned decades, cost millions of lives, and reshaped global politics, military strategy, and the hearts of generations. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you're watching. Now, let's settle in for a powerful and thought-provoking journey through history. We hope it helps you learn while you sleep. To understand the Vietnam War, we must go back, long before American helicopters hovered over jungles, before draft cards were burned on college campuses, and before television screens brought images of fire and fury into living rooms across the world. The roots of this long and bitter conflict stretch deep into the soil of Vietnam's colonial past. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Vietnam was part of French Indochina, a colony of the French Empire. The Vietnamese people, fiercely proud and deeply rooted in their culture, grew restless under colonial rule. They wanted independence, not occupation. Enter Ho Chi Minh, a man who would become the central figure in Vietnam's modern history. Educated abroad and inspired by Marxist-Leninist ideas, Ho returned to Vietnam and began organizing resistance. During World War II, Japan took control of Vietnam from the French, but Ho and his followers, known as the Viet Minh, fought back. With support from the Allies, they resisted Japanese occupation, not for imperial reasons, but for the dream of Vietnamese independence. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a crowd in Hanoi and declared Vietnam's independence. He quoted the American Declaration of Independence. "All men are created equal." But freedom was not to come so easily. The French, eager to reclaim their colony, returned, sparking the First Indochina War. It lasted nearly a decade, from 1946 to 1954. Ho Chi Minh led the communist-led Viet Minh against French forces in a bloody guerrilla campaign that culminated in the historic Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where French troops were decisively defeated. That defeat shook the colonial world. In 1954, at the Geneva Conference, world powers agreed to temporarily divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel, the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the non-communist state of Vietnam in the south, initially under Emperor Bao Dai, but soon to be led by a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. The division was meant to be temporary. Elections were scheduled for 1956 to unify the country. But those elections never happened. Diem, backed by the United States, refused to participate. American leaders, fearful of the spread of communism, the so-called domino theory, believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries in Southeast Asia would follow. And so, they threw their support behind Diem. Diem, a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, ruled with increasing authoritarianism. Corruption flourished. Political opponents were jailed. And in the countryside, a new resistance began to form. The Viet Cong, also known as the National Liberation Front, communist insurgents fighting to overthrow Diem and reunify the country under Ho Chi Minh's vision. By the early 1960s, South Vietnam was spiraling into chaos. The Viet Cong controlled large areas of rural territory. Diem's government was unpopular, and American advisors were pouring into the country, thousands by the year, tasked with training the South Vietnamese army and helping stabilize the region. But Vietnam was not a puzzle that could be solved with money or soldiers. It was a civil war. A war of ideas. A war where the enemy didn't always wear a uniform, and where loyalty was often shaped by generations of history, identity, and colonial trauma. By 1963, America stood at a crossroads. President John F. Kennedy, wary but committed, had increased U.S. involvement. That same year, Diem's regime, plagued by Buddhist protests and accusations of brutality, was overthrown in a coup, with quiet approval from Washington. Diem was assassinated. Kennedy, just weeks later, was as well. And so the stage was set for a new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, to inherit a situation that was quickly spinning out of control. What began as a war for Vietnamese independence had now become something much larger and far more dangerous. By 1964, the situation in Vietnam had become increasingly volatile. South Vietnam was plagued by instability. Since the assassination of President Diem the year before, the country had cycled through a series of military juntas, none strong enough to unify the country or effectively combat the growing insurgency. The Viet Cong were gaining strength in the countryside, launching ambushes, sabotaging outposts, and winning the loyalty of rural populations disillusioned with Saigon's corrupt and fragmented leadership. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had inherited the conflict from John F. Kennedy, faced a difficult choice. Johnson was not eager for war. His priority was domestic reform. His vision was the Great Society, not foreign intervention. But the specter of communism loomed large in Washington. The Cold War dominated global policy, and the idea of South Vietnam falling to communism was considered politically unacceptable. Then came the event that changed everything. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. destroyer USS Maddox, operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. 2 days later, a second incident was reported, though later evidence suggests this second attack may never have actually occurred. Regardless, the political consequences were swift and dramatic. President Johnson addressed the nation, stating that America would respond to aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the president broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. It was a turning point, the moment the United States shifted from advisor to active combatant. In March 1965, American combat troops landed at Da Nang, the first official deployment of U.S. ground forces. What began as a mission to protect air bases quickly evolved into a full-scale military campaign. By the end of 1965, over 180,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam. That number would soon triple. The war strategy was based on attrition, wear the enemy down, kill enough of them, and eventually they'd stop fighting. American commanders, led by General William Westmoreland, focused on search and destroy missions. Helicopters, a symbol of modern warfare, became essential, delivering troops into jungle clearings and evacuating the wounded under fire. But the jungle was unforgiving. The enemy was elusive. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army didn't fight set-piece battles. They used guerrilla tactics, underground tunnels, booby traps, and ambushes. They knew the terrain, it was their home. And they believed deeply in their cause. Meanwhile, the American public was being told the war was going well. Military briefings, known as 5 o'clock volleys, spoke of progress, body counts, and victory just around the corner. But the reality on the ground was far more complicated. Villages were bombed, often with tragic civilian casualties. Napalm and Agent Orange scarred the land and its people. American soldiers, many of them just 18 or 19 years old, fought a war they didn't fully understand, in a country they barely knew. Morale began to erode. Frustration set in. At home, television brought the war into people's living rooms. Images of burning villages, wounded soldiers, and caskets draped in flags began to change public opinion. What had begun as a distant commitment to stop communism was starting to feel like an endless, unwinnable war. Still, in 1966 and 1967, the troop buildup continued. Over 400,000 U.S. troops were now in Vietnam. The war machine was fully operational. Bombing campaigns, Operation Rolling Thunder, targeted North Vietnam relentlessly. Yet, the enemy would not break. The United States had entered Vietnam believing in its overwhelming power, in its ability to bend history. But the jungles, the politics, and the people of Vietnam would prove far more resilient than expected. The war was no longer just about Vietnam. It was about America's place in the world. And the cost of maintaining that position was growing higher by the day. By 1968, the Vietnam War had become the most intense and expensive foreign conflict the United States had ever engaged in. Over 500,000 American troops were deployed across South Vietnam. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded. Billions of dollars had been spent. And yet, victory remained elusive. General William Westmoreland and the U.S. government continued to assure the American people that the end was in sight, that the enemy was worn down, that the tide was turning. Then came the moment that shattered that illusion, the Tet Offensive. On January 30th, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year known as Tet, a nationwide ceasefire was expected. Instead, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong launched a coordinated surprise attack on more than 100 towns and cities across South Vietnam, including major strongholds like Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon. In Saigon, Viet Cong commandos even penetrated the U.S. Embassy compound, engaging in a gunfight that stunned the world. Though American forces ultimately repelled the attackers, the symbolism was devastating. If the U.S. Embassy, the heart of American power in Vietnam, could be breached, what did that say about control and victory? In the city of Hue, one of the most brutal and prolonged battles of the war unfolded. U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops fought street by street to retake the city. It took nearly a month. When it was over, Hue lay in ruins. Over 10,000 civilians had died, many executed by communist forces during their brief occupation. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a failure for the North. They suffered heavy losses, tens of thousands of fighters killed. But strategically it was a turning point. Because while the enemy was weakened, American confidence was shattered. The American public had been told the war was being won. Tet proved otherwise. Television news brought the images home: burning cities, wounded GIs, Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire. For many watching back in the U.S., the war suddenly felt not only unwinnable but senseless. Famed CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam himself, famously concluded in a televised report, "To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory, conclusion." President Lyndon B. Johnson, watching the broadcast, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Anti-war protests intensified. College campuses erupted with demonstrations. Draft cards were burned. Coffins were paraded down the streets of major cities. The nation, already divided by civil rights struggles, now fractured further under the weight of an unpopular war. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on soldiers grew heavier. Many GIs began to question their mission, their orders, and their purpose. Morale declined. Incidents of drug use, insubordination, and psychological trauma increased. Vietnam was no longer just a battlefield, it was a word that stirred anger, fear, and sorrow. In March 1968, just weeks after Tet, President Johnson made a stunning announcement. He declared he would not seek re-election. The war had cost him his presidency. Behind the scenes, he had already begun de-escalation talks with North Vietnam and ordered a halt to the bombing of the North. But for the soldiers on the ground, nothing had changed. The war raged on. By the end of 1968, more than 30,000 Americans had been killed. Millions of Vietnamese, both civilians and soldiers, had died. The countryside was scarred by bombs, defoliants, and destruction. And the political will to continue the war was fading fast. Tet had changed the war. Not because of territory lost or gained, but because of what it did to belief. Belief in the mission, belief in victory, belief in the truth from Washington. The Vietnam War was no longer about stopping communism. Now, it was about finding a way out. As 1969 began, America stood at a crossroads. The Tet Offensive had shaken the nation's confidence in its leaders and in the war itself. President Lyndon B. Johnson had stepped aside, and a new president, Richard Nixon, entered the White House with a promise to bring peace with honor. But what exactly did that mean? Nixon inherited a war that had cost thousands of American lives, devastated much of Vietnam, and fractured American society. His administration knew that an immediate withdrawal would likely collapse the South Vietnamese government and give victory to the communists. But continuing the war at its current scale was politically, and morally, unsustainable. The solution Nixon offered was something called Vietnamization. The idea was simple in theory: gradually reduce American troops and turn over more of the fighting to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. With enough training, equipment, and support, South Vietnamese forces would take full responsibility for their own defense. Meanwhile, the U.S. would slowly withdraw. But even as Nixon talked of ending the war, he also expanded it. Behind the scenes, he and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, authorized secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos, two neighboring countries officially neutral but known to be harboring North Vietnamese supply routes, the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. In March 1969, Operation Menu began, a covert bombing campaign aimed at destroying communist sanctuaries in Cambodia. The American public didn't know about it. Congress didn't either. The skies lit up with B-52 bombers, and villages far beyond Vietnam's borders were turned to rubble. The paradox of Nixon's strategy was clear: de-escalate publicly, escalate privately. In Vietnam, American troops continued to fight. But their mission was changing. Large-scale search and destroy missions gave way to defensive operations. More pressure was put on ARVN troops to lead the fight, with mixed results. Many South Vietnamese soldiers were brave and committed. Others were poorly trained, under-equipped, or unwilling. Corruption remained rampant. Desertions rose. And in the countryside, support for the government in Saigon was often lukewarm at best. Meanwhile, in the United States, the anti-war movement was reaching its peak. In 1969, over 500,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. for the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam, one of the largest demonstrations in American history. Students, veterans, clergy, and citizens from all walks of life demanded an end to the conflict. Then came a moment that shocked the conscience of the world. In November 1969, the public learned of the My Lai massacre, an event that had occurred over a year earlier. In March 1968, a unit of American soldiers had entered the village of My Lai and slaughtered more than 500 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The massacre had been covered up by military officials. But when the truth came out, it deepened the sense that the war was not only failing, it was morally broken. Despite this, Nixon remained determined. He continued troop withdrawals, reduced draft calls, and sought a diplomatic solution through back-channel talks with North Vietnamese leaders in Paris. But the negotiations were slow, filled with mistrust and political posturing. By 1970, over 150,000 American troops had been pulled out. Yet the war had not ended, far from it. The conflict was spilling across borders, deepening civilian suffering, and drawing new nations into its orbit. That year, Nixon ordered an invasion of Cambodia to destroy communist bases, reigniting protests across the U.S. and leading to tragedy on college campuses, most infamously at Kent State University, when National Guard troops shot and killed 4 unarmed students during a protest. The war that was supposed to be winding down was, in many ways, growing more unstable. Nixon's strategy, like the war itself, was full of contradictions: trying to exit without surrendering, trying to end the war without admitting it had already been lost in the hearts of many. And while diplomacy sputtered, the jungle still burned. As the 1970s began, the Vietnam War was no longer just a conflict within Vietnam's borders. The war had spilled into Laos and Cambodia, pulling 2 more nations into a spiral of destruction, often in the shadows, and often without the knowledge or consent of the people who lived there. This was the hidden war, the secret war, and it was a critical piece of the larger story. For years, North Vietnamese forces had used a complex network of supply routes, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to move troops, weapons, and supplies from North Vietnam to their fighters in the south. These routes twisted through Laos and Cambodia, bypassing conventional battle lines and exploiting the dense jungles and weak borders. To disrupt these supply lines, President Richard Nixon, working with National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, authorized massive bombing campaigns in both countries, initially in secret. In Laos, American aircraft dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs from 1964 to 1973, more than were dropped on Germany and Japan during all of World War II. The targets were often vague, based on limited intelligence. Entire villages were destroyed. The land was scarred, and civilians bore the brunt. In Cambodia, the campaign was known as Operation Menu, with bombing missions codenamed breakfast, lunch, dinner, and so on. These operations began in 1969 and intensified in 1970. Officially, the U.S. government denied the bombings were happening. In reality, tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Survivors would later speak of bombs falling without warning, of craters where homes once stood, of forests turned into moonscapes. And in both Laos and Cambodia, the chaos created political vacuums that would lead to even greater horrors. Back in Washington, the public eventually learned of the bombings through leaked reports and investigative journalism. Many Americans were stunned. These weren't just military strikes. They were campaigns conducted in countries not officially at war. When Nixon announced a ground invasion of Cambodia in April 1970, protests erupted across the United States. Students and activists flooded the streets, outraged by the expansion of a war that was supposed to be winding down. The most infamous of these protests occurred at Kent State University in Ohio. On May 4, 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9. The image of a young woman kneeling over the body of a fallen classmate became an icon of American anguish. The war had come home. Meanwhile, in Cambodia, the US-backed incursion failed to destroy the North Vietnamese presence as intended. Instead, it destabilized the Cambodian government and paved the way for the rise of the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist movement that would later carry out a genocide, killing nearly 2 million Cambodians. In Laos, the bombings and CIA-backed operations fueled civil war and devastated the Hmong population, who had been recruited to fight against communist forces. When the war ended, thousands of Hmong people were forced to flee or face persecution. Many resettled in the United States, beginning a new chapter in diaspora. As Nixon continued troop withdrawals from Vietnam, his administration justified the expanded bombing as a way to support Vietnamization, the idea that South Vietnam could only survive if the external support to its enemies was cut off. But this strategy came at an enormous cost, in lives, in credibility, and in the growing disconnect between what the government said and what people could see with their own eyes. By 1971, it was clear that the war had infected everything it touched. It was no longer confined to one country, one enemy, or one battlefield. The conflict had become a regional catastrophe, with ripple effects that would haunt Southeast Asia for decades. And for the American public, trust in government had never been lower. As the skies over Laos and Cambodia thundered with bombs, the question that had begun to emerge years earlier now echoed louder than ever. What are we fighting for, and at what cost? By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War was unraveling, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of the American public. The endless bombings, rising casualties, and widening conflict in Laos and Cambodia had already stirred massive dissent. But it was in 1971, with the release of the Pentagon Papers, that the full scope of government deception came into view. The Pentagon Papers were a classified, top-secret government study, commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense in 1967. Officially titled, United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945 to 1967. The report detailed the inner workings of America's involvement in Vietnam across 4 presidential administrations. It revealed that government officials had repeatedly misled the public about the war's goals, progress, and prospects for victory. The documents were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who had become disillusioned with the war. In June 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts. The government tried to halt the publication, citing national security, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press, affirming the right to publish the truth. What the public read was staggering. The papers showed that U.S. officials had known early on that the war was unlikely to be won, yet they had escalated involvement anyway. that the Gulf of Tonkin incident had been distorted, that public optimism was often a facade, and that thousands of young Americans had died in a war that, behind closed doors, many believed was unwinnable from the start. The fallout was enormous. Trust in the government, already battered, collapsed further. Young people, parents, veterans, and even members of Congress questioned not only the war, but the entire foundation on which it had been sold. Meanwhile, the Nixon administration continued to press forward with Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops while stepping up support for the South Vietnamese military. But with fewer U.S. soldiers on the ground, air power became the weapon of choice. In 1972, the U.S. launched Operation Linebacker, an intense bombing campaign targeting North Vietnam's infrastructure, railways, and ports. Later that year came Operation Linebacker 2, known as the Christmas bombings, in which B-52 bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives over Hanoi and Haiphong in an attempt to force North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. These bombings brought devastation to northern cities and enraged anti-war activists worldwide. The images of firebombed cities, wounded children, and flattened neighborhoods were broadcast on television and printed in newspapers, fueling global protests. Back in Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government under President Nguyen Van Thieu was still fragile, relying heavily on U.S. aid and air support. The Viet Cong, while weakened, continued their insurgency in the south, while North Vietnamese regular forces pushed from the north with increasing strength. Despite years of fighting, billions spent, and millions of lives lost, the fundamental situation had not changed: a divided country, a faltering ally, and an enemy that would not give up. And now, America itself was under siege, not from abroad, but from within. The war had triggered a cultural earthquake, massive protests, a fractured media, distrust in leadership, and a generation of youth skeptical of authority. College campuses were battlegrounds of another kind. The military draft loomed over families, with thousands of young men fleeing to Canada or facing jail for refusing to serve. The Vietnam War had become more than a foreign conflict. It was a national crisis, one that had tested the limits of democracy, freedom of the press, and the very idea of American exceptionalism. And yet, for all the chaos, a sliver of hope remained. In Paris, peace talks were inching forward. Slowly, painfully. The end was coming. But for many, soldiers, civilians, and survivors, it would come too late. By 1972, the war in Vietnam had dragged on for nearly a decade in full U.S. engagement, and much longer in Vietnamese memory. The toll was staggering. Over 50,000 American troops had been killed. Vietnamese casualties, both military and civilian, numbered in the millions. The jungles were scarred, the cities bombed, and the people divided. But in Paris, after years of slow, frustrating negotiations, there was finally movement. Peace talks had begun as early as 1968, but they had been bogged down by politics, posturing, and distrust. The key players at the table were the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. But progress came in inches, and often reversed just as quickly. Then came 1972, and another turning point. In the spring, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, a massive, conventional military campaign aimed at overwhelming South Vietnam before U.S. forces could fully withdraw. North Vietnamese troops surged across the DMZ and invaded the Central Highlands, capturing towns and forcing South Vietnamese forces into retreat. But this time, the South didn't stand alone. With fewer American troops on the ground, the United States responded with overwhelming air power. Operation Linebacker began, targeting bridges, fuel depots, and transportation networks. American airstrikes helped stabilize the front, and South Vietnamese forces, under President Nguyen Van Thieu, managed to push back. At the same time, diplomatic pressure intensified. President Richard Nixon, now facing re-election and domestic pressure to end the war, wanted a breakthrough. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, resumed secret meetings with North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho in Paris. For months they met in secrecy, trading proposals and threats, haggling over language and timelines. The biggest obstacle was the future of South Vietnam. North Vietnam wanted President Thieu removed and a new coalition government formed. The U.S. refused. Eventually, a compromise was reached. In October 1972, Kissinger announced that peace is at hand. The draft agreement called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of American forces, return of prisoners of war, and respect for the territorial integrity of South Vietnam, while allowing North Vietnamese troops already in the South to remain in place. But President Thieu, fearing betrayal, rejected the deal. He insisted on changes, delaying the agreement. Nixon, fearing political fallout, launched Operation Linebacker II, the Christmas bombings, a 12-day aerial assault on Hanoi and Haiphong, designed to pressure North Vietnam back to the table. It worked, in part. Though the bombings caused widespread destruction and international condemnation, North Vietnam returned to negotiations. On January 27, 1973, all parties signed the Paris Peace Accords. The war, at least for America, was officially ending. The agreement called for a complete U.S. troop withdrawal within 60 days, return of prisoners of war, ceasefire between North and South, recognition of both South Vietnam's government and the Communist Provisional Revolutionary Government. But beneath the paper's signatures, the reality was shaky. There was no enforcement mechanism to ensure the ceasefire held. North Vietnamese forces remained embedded across the South. The Viet Cong had not been dismantled. And South Vietnam, though still standing, was politically and militarily vulnerable. For the United States, the moment was bittersweet. American troops began returning home. Families welcomed POWs with tears and parades. But the feeling of victory was absent. There was relief, not triumph. And for South Vietnam, the future was uncertain. President Thieu remained in power, but his government was fragile and dependent on continued American aid. In the U.S., the public turned the page. The war was over, for them. The last combat troops left in March 1973. But the Vietnamese, North and South, remained trapped in a nation still divided, still bleeding. The war had ended. And yet, the peace felt temporary, like a candle flickering in a storm. In reality, it was the calm before the collapse. In early 1973, the Paris Peace Accords brought the United States' direct military involvement in Vietnam to an end. American troops were gone. Prisoners of war had been exchanged. For the first time in years, there was a moment of stillness. But in Vietnam, the war was far from over. The fragile ceasefire began to crack almost immediately. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had never fully withdrawn from South Vietnam. They held positions in the Central Highlands, the Mekong Delta, and near the Laotian and Cambodian borders. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese government, under President Nguyen Van Thieu, struggled to maintain order, facing internal corruption, economic instability, and a shrinking pool of support. As long as the U.S. remained involved diplomatically and financially, South Vietnam could hold on. But that support was rapidly evaporating. Back in the United States, the public was exhausted. The war had cost tens of thousands of American lives and billions of dollars. The political system was in turmoil. In 1974, President Nixon resigned in the wake of the Watergate scandal, and his successor, Gerald Ford, inherited a nation unwilling to invest another dollar in Vietnam. Congress, reflecting the mood of the people, cut off military aid to South Vietnam. Ammunition, spare parts, fuel, everything needed to sustain a modern army, began to dwindle. The South Vietnamese military, though well-trained, found itself under-equipped and isolated. In the north, Hanoi saw an opportunity. In early 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a limited offensive in the Central Highlands. To their surprise, the South Vietnamese defenses collapsed quickly. Entire divisions retreated in chaos. Civilians flooded the roads, creating massive panics. The collapse became contagious. What began as a small push soon turned into a full-scale assault. City after city fell, Ban My Thuot, Pleiku, Hue Da Nang. The South Vietnamese army, once over 1 million strong, crumbled under the weight of fear, poor leadership, and dwindling resources. In Saigon, panic spread. The streets were filled with rumors and fear. Everyone knew what was coming. By April 1975, North Vietnamese forces were closing in on the capital. The U.S. Embassy scrambled to evacuate American personnel and at-risk Vietnamese. What followed became one of the most iconic moments in modern history. On April 29th and 30th, in Operation Frequent Wind, helicopters lifted off from rooftops and the embassy courtyard, ferrying thousands to U.S. Navy ships offshore. Crowds of South Vietnamese swarmed the embassy gates, begging for a seat, holding up children, waving documents, anything to prove they deserved to be saved. Inside the embassy, Marines formed a final perimeter. As helicopters landed and departed in rapid succession, chaos reigned. Some clung to the skids of aircraft. Others stormed the gates. Thousands were left behind. At 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, 1975, the last U.S. Marine helicopter lifted off the rooftop of the embassy, leaving behind the sounds of gunfire, panic, and heartbreak. Just hours later, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. Soldiers raised the Viet Cong flag over the presidential palace. The war was over. The Republic of Vietnam had fallen. After 3 decades of conflict, Vietnam was unified under communist rule. For some, it was liberation. For others, it was loss. Thousands fled the country in boats, beginning the long and dangerous journey as refugees. Many would settle in America, Australia, Canada, and Europe, rebuilding lives far from home. They carried with them memories of a homeland divided, a war endured, and a dream lost. For the Vietnamese people, North and South, the price had been immense. And for America, the image of helicopters fleeing rooftops became a symbol, not just of defeat, but of the limits of power and the cost of intervention. The war was over. But the wounds, political, cultural, emotional, would remain for generations. The Vietnam War may have ended on April 30th, 1975, but for millions of people, the struggle continued long after the last shot was fired. The cost of the war was not measured only in bullets and bombs, but in lives shattered, families torn apart, and a legacy that would linger for decades. For the Vietnamese people, the war was not just a foreign intervention, it was their land, their homes, their history. An estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese civilians died during the conflict, many from bombings, crossfire, or displacement. Millions more were wounded or permanently disabled. Entire villages were wiped out in airstrikes. Fields were poisoned with Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant sprayed by U.S. aircraft to destroy jungle cover used by the Viet Cong. But Agent Orange didn't just kill trees, it seeped into soil and water, leading to severe birth defects, cancer, and long-term health crises that continue in Vietnam to this day. Children were born with malformed limbs, missing organs, and other devastating conditions, and not just in Vietnam. Many American veterans exposed to Agent Orange also suffered from illnesses that were not fully acknowledged for years. For soldiers, both American and Vietnamese, the war was deeply personal. American troops returned home to a country that often didn't welcome them. Unlike the parades for World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans were sometimes met with silence, anger, or indifference. Many struggled to reintegrate into society. Some faced public scorn, others internal guilt or confusion. The psychological toll was immense. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, wasn't officially recognized until years after the war, but it lived in the minds of thousands of veterans. Nightmares, flashbacks, depression. Many turned to drugs or alcohol. Some ended their lives, unable to carry the weight of what they had seen or done. In Vietnam, the suffering was even deeper. After the war, those who had fought for the South Vietnamese army or had worked with the United States were labeled as traitors by the new communist government. Many were sent to re-education camps, prisons in all but name, where they faced forced labor, indoctrination, and harsh conditions. Thousands never returned. Families fled by boat, the now famous boat people, risking everything on the open sea to escape political persecution and economic collapse. Many died along the way. Pirates, storms, and starvation claimed countless lives. Those who survived found refuge in countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. A new Vietnamese diaspora was born, resilient, but forever marked by displacement. Back in the US, the war transformed the national conversation. It forced Americans to question the government, to doubt military decisions, to speak out against injustice. The anti-war movement, though divisive at the time, laid the groundwork for future generations of activism. It also changed how wars were fought and reported. The media's role in shaping public perception became undeniable. For the first time, uncensored footage of combat, death, and civilian suffering was broadcast nightly on television. The war became a living room war, impossible to ignore. In later years, efforts were made to heal the wounds. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built in Washington, D.C., a black granite wall etched with the names of over 58,000 Americans who died. Visitors leave flowers, letters, dog tags. It is a place of memory, grief, and reflection. And in Vietnam, efforts began to clean up bomb sites, remove landmines, and recover missing bodies. Reconciliation, though slow, began to take root. But the scars remain, in the land, in the bodies of the wounded, in the eyes of those who survived. The human cost of the Vietnam War cannot be calculated in numbers alone. It lives in the silence between conversations, in the names etched in stone, in the memories passed down through generations. It is a cost still being paid. The Vietnam War was over, but the questions it left behind would echo for decades. What did it all mean? Was it worth it? Who won? Who lost? And what was America's role in a war fought so far from home, against a people with whom many Americans shared no language, no culture, and no understanding? The legacy of the Vietnam War is complex, a tangled web of sacrifice, failure, courage, tragedy, and hard-learned lessons. In the United States, the war left a deep scar on the national psyche. It shattered the trust between the people and their government. For the first time in modern history, the American public had watched, almost in real time, a war that didn't follow the heroic script of World War II. The idea of American exceptionalism, that the U.S. was destined to spread freedom and democracy around the globe, was challenged in the muddy rice paddies and burning jungles of Southeast Asia. Vietnam showed the limits of power and the dangers of hubris. The U.S. military reevaluated its doctrine. The war revealed the flaws of relying on body counts and technological superiority in a conflict rooted in ideology, nationalism, and guerrilla tactics. For decades after, military strategists studied Vietnam not to replicate its strategy, but to avoid its mistakes. Politically, the war redefined foreign policy. The so-called Vietnam Syndrome took hold, a reluctance to engage in military conflicts abroad, especially without clear objectives, public support, and an exit strategy. This attitude influenced U.S. policy from the late 1970s through the early 1990s. In the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, efforts were made to reclaim the honor of those who served. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, dedicated in 1982, became a powerful space for national healing. The names etched in black granite drew millions of visitors. For veterans, it offered long overdue recognition. In Vietnam, the war's legacy unfolded differently. The newly unified country faced enormous challenges: economic isolation, devastated infrastructure, and lingering bitterness. It wasn't until the late 1980s, with economic reforms known as Doi Moi, that Vietnam began to recover. Today, Vietnam is a fast-growing country with a booming economy and a youthful population. The war, while not forgotten, is often framed through the lens of resilience and national unity. The once enemy, the United States, is now one of Vietnam's major trading partners. The two nations normalized relations in 1995, and in the decades since, American presidents have visited Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, walking the same streets where once bombs fell and soldiers fought. Still, the war lives on in the stories passed from parents to children. In the photographs, the graves, the songs. In the unexploded ordnance still buried in the earth. In the veterans who return, decades later, to find peace in the place where they once fought. Culturally, the Vietnam War influenced art, film, music, and literature. Movies like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and The Deer Hunter shaped public understanding of the war, not through politics, but through human experience. Protest songs, novels, and memoirs created a new kind of war story, personal, raw, and unglamorous. But perhaps the deepest legacy of Vietnam is the conversation it started, about power, morality, truth, and the cost of war. It forced a generation to ask hard questions. It empowered a new wave of activism. It taught the world that even the most powerful nation cannot always reshape history through force alone. The Vietnam War was not just about one country's struggle for unification or another's fear of communism. It was about the collision of ideals and realities, the failures of leadership, and the resilience of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. And so we remember, not to glorify war, but to understand it, and to do better.